When my husband saw his friends walk in, a tale of fear and shadows. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, one of those quiet, unassuming nights where nothing extraordinary happens. We had just finished dinner, and my husband sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. The soft hum of the television filled the room, a comforting backdrop to the otherwise silent house. But everything changed the moment his friends walked in. At first, I thought it was a joke. The door creaked open slowly, and 3 figures stepped inside. My husband froze, his phone slipping from his hand and landing on the floor with a muted thud. I turned to him, confused and slightly alarmed, but the look on his face sent chills down my spine. His eyes widened in sheer terror, his breathing quickened, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the figures now standing in the doorway. The 3 men were familiar, I recognized them instantly as his childhood friends. They were people we had seen countless times at gatherings and reunions. Yet, something about them was different tonight. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, their eyes hollow and devoid of life. They stood unnaturally still, their presence exuding an eerie energy that made the air around us feel heavy and suffocating. "Why are they here?" my husband finally managed to mutter, his voice trembling. I didn't understand the question. Weren't they just visiting? But as I looked closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. These weren't the same people I had met before. There was an uncanny stillness to them, as though they weren't entirely human anymore. Their movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical, as they stepped further into the room. "Close the door," my husband whispered urgently, but it was too late. The 3 figures were already inside. One of them, a man named Hui, spoke first. Or at least, I think it was him. His voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "We've come back," he said, his lips barely moving. "Back from where?" I asked, my voice shaking. I didn't want to know the answer, but the words escaped me before I could stop them. Hui didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his hollow eyes boring into mine. The other 2 figures remained silent, their expressions blank, but somehow menacing. My husband stood up abruptly, backing away from them. "You're not real," he said, his voice rising in panic. "You're not supposed to be here." The 3 figures exchanged glances, or at least it seemed like they did, before stepping closer to him. My husband stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table in his haste to get away from them. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Leave us alone." It was then that one of them, a man named Kwong, finally spoke. "You made a promise," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. "What promise?" I asked, desperate for answers. My husband didn't look at me, he kept his eyes on them as though looking away would make them disappear. "You said you'd never forget," Kwong continued. "But you did." "I didn't mean to," my husband cried out. "I didn't mean to forget. Please, just leave us alone." I had no idea what he was talking about, but the raw fear in his voice made my heart race. It was clear that these weren't just old friends dropping by for a visit. They were something else entirely, something far more sinister. The 3rd figure, a man named Min, finally moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it up for us to see. It was a photograph, worn and faded with age. My husband's face went pale as he stared at it. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "You gave it to us," Min replied calmly. "Before everything changed." "I don't remember," my husband whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't want to remember," Hui said coldly. "But you will." At that moment, the lights flickered violently before plunging us into darkness. I reached out blindly for my husband's hand, but he wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I called out his name, my voice echoing in the pitch-black room. When the lights came back on, the 3 figures were gone, but so was my husband. I searched the house frantically, calling out for him over and over again. There was no answer. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faint scent of fear that still lingered in the air. I found the photograph lying on the floor where men had stood moments earlier. My hands trembled as I picked it up and examined it closely. It was a picture of my husband with his 3 friends, but something about it was wrong. Their faces were blurred and distorted, their smiles twisted into grotesque expressions that sent shivers down my spine. I don't know what happened that night or where my husband went. All I know is that he was terrified of something connected to those 3 men who weren't really men at all. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of him. The police couldn't explain his disappearance. They told me there was no evidence of foul play or forced entry. But I knew better. Sometimes at night, I hear faint whispers coming from the living room, voices that sound eerily familiar yet completely foreign at the same time. And every now and then, I catch glimpses of shadowy figures standing just beyond the doorway, watching me with hollow eyes. I don't know if they'll come back for me too, or if they've already taken everything they wanted. All I know is that I'll never forget the look on my husband's face when he saw his friends walk in, a look of pure, unadulterated terror that will haunt me for the rest of my life. And perhaps that's exactly what they wanted all along, for me to remember what he tried so desperately to forget.